Hello, everybody. My name is Mirko Novakovic. I am co-founder and CEO of Zero, and welcome to Code Red. Code, because we are talking about code, and red stands for requests, errors, and duration, the core metrics of observability. On this podcast, you will hear from leaders around our industry about what they are building, what's next in observability, and what you can do today to avoid your next outage.
Today, my guest is Kaspar von Grünberg. Kaspar is an early pioneer in platform engineering. He's been building IDPs at scale over the last decade, and he actually coined the term IDP, which we will talk about. As the founder and CEO of Humanitec, he's part of the team behind Score and the platform orchestrator. I'm really excited to talk to Kaspar today, and Kaspar, welcome to Code Red.
Thank you so much, Mirko. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and you are the first one who is not a CEO of an observability company, but a platform engineering company. So I still have to ask you the first question, which is, what was your Code Red moment?
Right, my Code Red moment. I had, a couple of fun ones. Like we once, didn't protect our production Postgres database well. At the last software I built, which was then, some fun guys somewhere in Nigeria held our data captive. And we had to backwards deduct this and didn't realize it was a huge disaster and very, very embarrassing because we missed the basic one-on-one. That was not the Code Red moment that led us to build Humanitec. That moment was when one of our DevOps engineers came to us 2015 and said hey, I would like to have double the salary I have right now. He was at 60K, which for Berlin 2015, that was already a lot of money. And then he asked for 120. And I turned to my CTO and said Greg, why the hell should I do this? That's usually the moment where I said hey, goodbye. You're probably not meeting our cultural values. And Greg said unfortunately, we don't know how to deploy if that guy leaves. So I'm afraid we have to double the salary. And we ended up doubling the salary, and as always, 3 months later, the guy leaves anyways, and we weren't able to deploy for a while. So you're seeing that, I've been following best practices in software engineering for a long time now. But that was really the moment where I thought, you can't have that much key person dependency. At some points, you need to react to this. You need to know what's going on, right? The theme of observability. And you need to make sure that you can act on the stuff that you are learning. And if that's depending on one human being not in the time zone where you need them to be at the moment, or that person is holding you hostage, then the best observability doesn't really help you because you need to react on that. And that was the moment where we said, okay, that's probably a more fundamental problem in the market.
That's already a good problem to start a company, right?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I think there are two terms I really want to discuss here, which I found really interesting. And one is IDP, which stands for Internal Developer Platform. And the other is the more general term, and I would say pretty popular term at the moment, platform engineering and platform engineers. It's a whole topic I'm really excited about talking to you because you are the expert here and I have a lot of questions. But let's start with IDP because I think that's where you started also, right? I as a disclaimer, I was an angel investor in Humanitec. And at the time we talked, you basically explained me, when I remember it correctly, it said, hey, all the big companies like Google, the big tech companies, they have a developer platform, which is essentially, as far as I understood it, a self-service platform for developers to quickly set up their environment and deploy their application, basically without having to maintain all the infrastructure pieces, but also the process around it, including deployments, etc. You said, hey, and this actually will become the standard for all companies, right? Because especially smaller companies don't want to build their own environment. And so you founded Humanitec to build IDPs, correct?
So we founded Humanitec, and Humanitec is a really, really interesting story because I always say it's a little bit like, we are developing engines for trains, but tracks weren't invented and trains weren't invented either. So we had to, there was a lot to do, and there's still a lot to do. It's a pretty heavy lift. We are developing tools that help platform engineers build these platforms. So the key observation that I shared back then was when cloud native came up and we had that huge shift left, right? 2008, you have Werner Vogels, who was the CTO at Amazon at that point, proclaim developers should build it and run it. And that was sort of his big statement. And the entire industry followed over the next years. So when everybody made the move into cloud native, they said, okay, the developers should actually own the Amazon account and all of that, all of these things. Now, unfortunately, what most people don't know is that Amazon was a really, really tiny engineering organization, at least from the perspective of the engineering organizations that you and I probably work with, that are more in the dozens and hundreds of developers. And Werner Vogels had never led a large engineering organization. Like, that is amazing guy, great CTO, but at that point, he was a scientist, right? And he had just started to manage a couple dozen engineers. And so that idea of you build it, you run it is a really cute idea if you have a couple engineers, but it's pretty dangerous idea actually if you have hundreds of engineers, because people are leaving all the time and you have security concerns. And so when you looked at the progression in the early 10s, right, you could see that 5 years after the big tech companies jumped on that train wagon, they realized, this is probably not working. We have to structure this more. We have to treat the supply chain, if you want, the digital factory that developers work when they're building their application, more as a product. That idea of treating that idea as a product. And you can see this in America, with Google, obviously. You can see this with Netflix. In Europe, you can see this with Zalando building a pretty large platform. And I was going back and forth with Jason Warner. Jason was the VP engineering at Heroku. And Heroku is a platform as a service, so that's sort of a fully managed platform. And he then became the CTO at GitHub in 2017, I think. And he looked at the setup in GitHub, so the actual developers building GitHub, and said, this is probably, we can probably speed this up and structure this a little better if we would have Heroku. Unfortunately, GitHub can't use Heroku because, scale and needs more flexibility in configuration. And so they started to build something like an internal Heroku. And so this came up. My colleague and co-founder, Chris, had built one of the platforms at Google. And we said, okay, if the trend is that many, many organizations are going to build their own internal Heroku, their own internal platform, then they probably need the tools and the back-end systems and the front ends and the portals to build these platforms. Also, at some point we said, well, we probably should give the child a name. So we literally sat down and said, if an organization is building a platform for their developers, how do we call that? And we were literally, this is so funny to look back because there are so many people are using this now, but we literally debated, should we call it developer platform? And we decided against, because back then the API platforms of Facebook and Twilio and stuff were also called developer platforms. So we said, okay, it's for internal developers mostly. Let's call it internal developer platform. And, that continued. There was a sort of relatively small circle of people, including you, debating the topic of, how are the practitioners building these platforms called? Like a guy next to me, Florian Lipp, said, let's call them platform engineers. So now, this year, it's on 9 hype cycles with Gartner and mentioned everywhere. And we have hundreds of people signing up to getting certified as platform engineers. So that train is running. But it's actually, we're in the very early days, and we're also figuring stuff out as we go.
Okay, but there are many words, and I have to be honest, I'm a little bit struggling always with the words, right? So I remember, I'm a long time in this industry. There was this big trend of DevOps, right?
Yeah.
That was essentially, so before you had the developers and then you had ops. And at that time, that's when I programmed, right? I programmed stuff on my laptop, then I throw it over a wall and I didn't care anymore, right? It was not my problem to run the application. And so essentially, DevOps that was already a shift left movement somehow, right? That you try to bring the teams together and you code it, you run it, right? So give the responsibility to a team, which was a mixture of development operations. And then I remember this famous site reliability engineering book from Google came out, where essentially they said, hey, you need engineers running or operating because you need a lot of automation, you need a lot of code, you need them to understand observability built in. And so it's more stuff like Terraform came up, right, where you had a lot of automation, infrastructure as code. So that's kind of where I understand. And what you are saying is then somehow, as far as I understood, a standardization happened. So we figured out that you need kind of the internal developer platform. This is kind of the standardization so that not everybody has to do all the manual work. And those engineering, building those platforms are now platform engineers. Is that somehow, can you help me get this somehow together? It's so many words and so many different words.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the progression. You have the throw over the wall situation, right? You then have that idea of this isn't working. Let's deconstruct this. Like anarchy, everybody does everything. Like literally, you have people, and it still happens, right? You just give your team like an Amazon account and say you do whatever you want. Now, do whatever you want. That's okay for the beginning, but somebody has to, pick up the pieces. Make sure that this is like the configs are streamlined. Make sure that we don't have. I mean, my lackmus test, if you want, is I ask the organization, can you tell me how many Postgres databases you have running for staging environments? They return we have 200. Okay. How many materially different ways do you have to configure those 200 Postgres databases? They say we don't know, 200. Like every developer is doing their own thing. So then I always ask them, okay, as engineers, let's take a step back. How many ways are there to configure Postgres databases in staging? Like RDS has 195 different factors you can tune, but there are really 3, 4, 5 different ways of configuring RDS in staging. So then you say, okay, if as engineers we agree that there are only 5 ways of configuring RDS in staging, but you have 200, what's the reason for the 195? Because they're creating overhead. They are, somebody has to maintain them. Somebody has to update them pretty frequently. Somebody has to respond to outages, observe them.
There's
all of
risk.
These things.
There's risk.
There's risk.
Right?
Yeah. Every configuration you have is risk. So then you have to ask yourselves, well, if you let everybody do everything, nobody will be able to agree on a config standard. So at some point we need to say, let's take a step back and let's structure this a little more. And let's say there are at least defaults and golden paths so that if the developer needs a Postgres database for staging, they can pick the default. That default is lifecycle managed. The updates are done for the person. We make sure that observability, let's take the example. The workload has a sidecar container to make sure that everything is picked up. All of these things are enforced. And then if the developer says, well, my application needs something else, I need a 6th way of configuring Postgres, that's okay, right? They can leave that, what Netflix calls the golden path, and they can go on their own. But that probably also means that then they are responsible for the SLA and all of these things. So the art of crafting these golden paths, setting these standards, and providing a consistent, well thought through system that developers can use and that drives standardization and developer self-service by design. That's what we call an internal developer platform. And people are sometimes confused because they want to see like a tangible, they have a tangible idea how that platform looks like. And if I'm looking at the platform built with Humanitec, then you do see repeatable patterns. They all look more or less the same, but there is not the absolute IDP because otherwise you could just use Heroku. So how the platform looks is really also depending on the cultural context of the organization.
And is it something you would say you need a certain size to get started with? So, I don't know, a minimum number of developers, or when do you think you should start with your IDP and platform?
I don't think you should do that if you have less than 50, maybe even 100 developers, because I just think if you're a small team, everybody should do everything, and you have short communication paths. And you're a startup, you shouldn't restrict yourself with too much standardization, right? You should move fast and you should bash out things. You should maybe, I always think you should consider using Heroku as long as possible, right? There's really nothing wrong with that. You don't lose your honor if you're using Heroku. It's actually a pretty good tool. And then as you're growing larger, or if you tell me, hey, we're going to double our engineering team in size, we're 50 developers now, that's probably like a good idea to start considering this. But the majority of the organizations that work with us are in the range of 250 developers plus into the hundreds of developers.
Yeah, that makes sense. I also think that maybe it also depends for startups. I remember in Stana when we were growing very fast, one of the problems we had was onboarding, right? So when new developers join and you have, 10 developers per month join your organization, then you have a lot of friction and issues and time to set up the environments for the developers, tell them how to use it. Is that something an IDP can help also? Or
yeah, absolutely. So that is one of the use cases where you're able to say, for instance, I have structured way of configuring something. I have a structured user interface that will help me get into things. I have a common RBAC profile that I can just be onboarded to, and I have access to all of these different things. I have scaffolding functionality where I say, like, I need ABC, and I just need to describe this, and it's created for me. So all of that is something that's absolutely, the onboarding case for developers is a big driver also from a pain point perspective, because that's expensive, right? It counts into retention. It counts into every time. Like I've just looked at the example. If you're in enterprise in America, you assume that every senior developer costs you $1,500 a day, right? So you can do the math on that.
Let's talk about the product, what it really is, right? If I look at your website, there is basically a product called Platform Orchestrator, right? Mm-hmm. And then you also have an open source product called Score. Mm-hmm. Can you a little bit elaborate what Score is and how you use that, and what that, I saw you have some traction on the project, right, on GitHub, what it actually is and how it works together with the orchestrator, what the orchestrator is. So what as a customer, what do I get?
Absolutely. So I think that platform architecture is a lot like software architecture, right? You have a front end, you have a back end, you need to have interfaces to engage with that platform, and you need to have a back end that actually does the logic handling. So our core product is the orchestrator, which is a back end for logic handling of platforms. If you really want to simplify it, there's a request coming in from the developer, I need an S3 bucket or any resource for my workload. That request will make its way to the orchestration. The orchestration will say, okay, well, that's the request. What's the global standard for S3 in the context? Let's say in staging. Grab that standard, generate the app and infrastructure configurations, weaves this together, runs sign-offs, and executes this, right? Intersects with your CI/CD pipeline, gets wired into this, and then builds a graph in the backend. This is a graph-based backend of all the different dependencies that it can update and lifecycle manage, make sure that the S3 bucket is always on the latest version, make sure that there are no vulnerabilities, make sure that the workloads are all observed by Zero. Like all of these things is something that the orchestrator can take care of. So really like a logic handling backend for platforms. Now, you need interfaces for developers to interface with that backend. You could just call the API, but that's not super attractive. So we've come up with the idea of having a code-based interface. So developers want to stay where they are, right, in their inner loop, in the version control system. They don't like swapping into a user UI or any of that. So we want to make sure that we do not change their workflow too much. And with Score, they can just describe what their workload needs. It's a YAML format, if you want, like a spec, a convention that we've handed over to the CNCF. And Score allows the developers to describe the relationship of the workload and dependent resources in, I would call that, in an environment agnostic way. So in a Score file, you say, I have a workload called product service. It needs a Postgres, S3, and DNS. And if you take this and then you do git push and you say, give me this for development, then this will be translated and the orchestrator will make sure that the development environment is up and all the resources are configured following the global standard and it's observed and all of these different things. And if I say, hey, I want this for production, I just take the same Score file, I push this to production, the same thing will happen to prod. Even local, I can run Score Compose and I'll have everything running on my local machine. And next to this code-based interface, we also have a user interface for a platform, which is called a portal in platform engineering terms. And that is really just like the code-based Score file, but in click ops. Some people do that. Most people keep that as code.
Interesting. And one of the things I love about OpenTelemetry is what they call the semantic convention, where they basically, do you have something similar in Score? So if I define S3 bucket, is there a standard how I specify that, or can I just define anything? Is it just a templating specification, or does it define the semantics and behind it.
It can define the semantics, exactly. And so we're trying to actually push a standard there, because S3 is a great example. It's called, in this cloud it's called this way, and in this cloud it's called this way, right? And so, which is useless. Like, this is really just one of these ideas the hyperscalers do, and I completely respect that. I would do that the same thing, but that drives a little bit of lock-in, all of these things. Many of our customers are multi-cloud, or at least they have the legal obligation to, be able to swap between clouds. So you want to have a semantic convention that actually spans as all the different providers, and that's what we're trying to achieve. We're actually also investing pretty heavily in making these default golden paths, these how should an S3 bucket be configured in staging available. And we are working with the cloud providers. We are working with suppliers like MongoDB for Atlas to say, hey, what do you think should be the general way of configuring MongoDB Atlas in staging for a medium load application, and then making those conventions also available. And then you have sort of the score naming convention. You have the off-the-shelf standards, and you can then bring that together and orchestrate that, and you can build that layer above the cloud that I've been dreaming of for a long time. It's a pretty tough thing to pull off because so many things in motion. But if that all clicks, then it's a pretty exciting idea for the next years here in software development. Really,
you should actually check out OpenTelemetry if it's a CNCF project, because it would be pretty cool if those semantic conventions would be standardized overall, right?
Yeah.
Because then if you have already defined in SCORE, basically your infrastructure, as far as I understood, what you want to have, you could automatically apply those tags to your instrumentation, right? To the metrics, to the logs, so that you could automatically, I'm thinking of an observability vendor, right?
Actually.
So I could actually take your SCORE configuration to understand how your system looks like, and then I could use that information to apply and tell you, hey, there's the logs for that service, or here's a problem, right? Because we speak the same language. It's always a problem in observability that we don't speak the same language, right? That would be actually true.
Maybe you could even, at the create time of the service, forward the intent of how the observability is supposed to happen by aligning this with the telemetry standard. That's an interesting thought, yeah.
Yeah, and we also see the same, what we try to do right now or what's already happening is standardizing a few things on top of it, right? How do I create an alert for S3, for example? And there are projects like awesome Prometheus alerts, GitHub projects where you have hundreds of predefined alerts. And we want to do the same for dashboards, right? We say, hey, there's a new CNCF project called Perseus, and that's a standard JSON format for dashboards. And we want to provide how does an RDS dashboard look like? And now we could map that and speak the same language. You not only defined that you want your RDS service, but your observability tool already knows which alerts to set and which dashboards to provide you based on that golden standard, right? That would be...
Yeah, that actually sounds really interesting.
I really like that idea, right? Bringing the two things together.
Yeah, and I'm seeing this all the time with the customers, right? First, we thought like no customer would seriously consider our standard for how we think S3 should be configured in Amazon staging. But actually, they come and say like, look, we're not of the opinion that we have the gold standard. If there's a joint standard that's been rolled out pretty heavily, right? We're happy to rely on that. And so they're actually just taking the Terraform of their provider, adding their security posture. And I guess the same would hold true for observability, right? People want experts to have opinions and then also, share best practices. That's what we're seeing continuously across everything we're doing.
As a developer, I always like tools like Stack Overflow or something because it's essentially copy paste and then optimize, right? You want to have some sort of how do I start? Or you mentioned scaffolding, right? When Ruby on Rails came out, you had these scaffolding commands where you essentially build an application and then you just put in the stuff that you needed or adopted it, and it just gives you speed, right? Not only that it provides you with the best practice how to do it and you learn from it, but it also gives you speed, and it doesn't require you to do all the boilerplate stuff that you don't want to do anyway. So I like it a lot. And so now that you have the SCORE specification and I define my infrastructure, then you put that into your tool. The orchestration then uses that score file to actually provision the things that are defined in there, or how does it work?
Let's say I have an existing score file, and now I want to add a Redis. You add 2 lines, give me cache of type Redis, and then you just push this. So it makes its way through your CI pipeline, hits the orchestration. The orchestration analyzes that change and gets the context. So let's say we're deploying to staging. It's then simply doing a lookup and goes and it says, okay, what's the convention of how the organization wants to configure Redis in staging? And this is defined as code again. We call this defined in a resource definition. So the organization might say, Redis in staging, we're using this Terraform file by the way it's parameterized. And we want this cloud account, and this is the naming convention for the Redis. We can take all of those resource definitions, we queue the execution, we generate the Redis, maybe even the roles, necessary networking. We could even create a new account, whatever you want. Really, there's no limit. And then we will generate the app configurations or regenerate the app configurations because now you need configurations that also include Redis. So that means we have the new configurations, we have the container image, we have the different resources, and then we inject the secrets into all of this and we serve. This whole workflow is sort of the create workflow. The more common workflow is the update workflow. So let's say I want to update all the Redis across my estate. Because everything's a graph, I can say, okay, where's Redis running? Update my global convention, and then push to the entire system. And then all Redis will progressively, in a careful way, there's sort of fleet rollout capability, progressively update. And that means I have way less configurations that I have to maintain, right? I don't have hundreds of repositories. I have everything in a graph, and usually most Redis in a given context look the same.
And you said the interface is basically GitHub. So I can, as a developer, I can have my score file versioned with my code. And when I hit the code into the repository, it will automatically detect it and trigger that orchestration engine, or how?
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. Nothing else.
Oh, that's pretty cool. So it's similar to, I'm not programming anymore, but I recently did a change in our platform, a little change. It's my only commit, I have to say, in Zero. But we are using Vercel as the platform for our UI, and I found that so amazing that I just pushed the code, and it automatically creates the environment. It creates for my branch. It created me a test environment where only my little fix was in there. I could test it. It was amazing, right? And so it's something similar, right? This orchestration layer.
Exactly the same experience for the developer that you have with Vercel. You say, give me a new branch, boom, PR environment up, new infrastructure up, everything ready for testing. We'll just give you the URL and you can start testing. But we are essentially, if you are a large enterprise, you can just not use Vercel because you have certain scaling criteria and data privacy. And so if you're in a situation where you want to build your own Vercel, then you're using us to do it.
I was so fascinated, right? Because when I developed, you did this all manually. It was super complicated. And I like this approach of integrating this into GitHub. Yeah, amazing. I really like the idea. And so where in this situation now, if I use Humanitec, do I need a platform engineer?
You do, because in the end, at large scale, there is so much to think through, right? What's our security posture and how, in Vercel, you just say, here, global standard, whatever, I don't really care. But if you are you're working for Convera Western Union, is sort of has hundreds of application developers working with a platform that they've built with our systems. And for them, it really matters how a Postgres is configured in any given context, right? Because security posture, compliance, all of these things. So you need to have these people that think about what's our standard, why are all of this. At enterprise scale, you don't have one CI provider, you have 4 or 5. There will be GitHub Actions and GitLab and Circle CI. And that's normal for the enterprise, right? Because you're constantly buying new stuff, and that all of that has to be integrated with the platform because you want to have a consistent experience. So we will need platform engineers for the next 10 years. I think that is a good job to get into, and that's still.
And how do they work? are they working inside of your tool in a UI, or do they program something, or are they building new interfaces that do not exist, or build these golden standards? So how do they work?
Platform engineers think about the glue, if you want. Like for the stuff that's important for them is what happens between my GitHub and my CI pipeline and my registry and my orchestration and my portal and my cloud and all of that. I'm a big believer in everything as code. Like, so you could probably configure stuff through the user interface, but people that work with us, they work with, the Terraform provider for the orchestrator. They will work with our CLI. They will really build a platform as code. We talk a lot about that. The platform should be seen as a product. And I think if you're building a software product, right, that's code first, because you can test it, you have disaster recoverability, you can version it. So the platform engineer is, those are developers that are often coming from the app dev field or former infrastructure and operations people, and that are sticking their heads together and really thinking about how can we build a consistent experience. And there will be literally a repository called the platform where they're building the platform.
I totally agree. I mean, we had really by accident yesterday when we were walking to the restaurant here on our offsite in Lisbon, we were discussing, because we do also all the dashboards, all the alerts inside of DashZero, you can just deploy with your code, right? And somebody asked why, right? And it's not only that you are in your environment where you naturally work, right? I also think you have the power of that tool stack, right? Rolling back thing, going back to a version, comparing things in your tool set. So all this is actually pretty complicated if you build it from scratch, right? So by doing this as code, you also get all the benefits of CI/CD platforms, of version control systems, of rollbacks, branches. All the things are there for you without doing anything, right? It's a very powerful and understood platform by developers, which you don't want to replicate in a UI, right? It's not what the user wants, probably, because they want to use the tools they have, but it's also super complicated to build.
And it's also, frankly, just not secure, right? You cannot apply policy checking, you cannot screen this. Like, there's so many things that, are scary.
Yeah, and let's talk about observability in platforms. I know you have these blueprints, right, and in your community, and I did a blueprint a little bit to show how observability is integrated in platforms. And now that we talked, actually, I have more ideas around Score and bringing the things together. But I guess that every platform needs to be observed, right? I don't think you have customers who deploy platforms and have no information and logs and trace and metrics out of those platforms.
Exactly. And that's actually twofold. You need to observe the platform itself, like, because at this point, right, these platforms are the epicenter of your development, right? If it's like you're Audi, you're producing cars and the factory is down, that's really, really expensive. So you need to observe those, the platforms themselves. And you need to make sure that standardizing or having that level of standardization always gives you the option to say, hey, now I can actually also make sure we make it really easy to include observability by design, right? We have sidecar containers next to the workloads that are running to make sure we can also always pick up stuff. We make sure that we collect all the traces, like really ingraining observability by design into the flows and saying, if I'm on that path, I have optimal traceability, I have optimal observability, both for the infrastructure as well as the workload running on any compute. That's so great, because how many organizations are there that are paying incredible amounts of money to certain providers in the observability stack, but then half of the services aren't configured the right way because the central teams have no way of enforcing this, and constantly need to call the developer and say, like, can you please make sure that this and this agent is there? So I think this is a huge chance to make sure we have consistent observability across the entire estate.
Absolutely. There's one thing that I also think is very important, which I wouldn't say that we found the final answer yet, but when we talk about observability for developers, we always say the developer. But I do think there is a huge difference between an application engineer and a platform engineer, right? Because the platform engineer does not really care of the individual service and application. They care more how the platform is running, right? And then you have the individual service developer or the developer that builds an application. They care more. They care more about the application, right? So I think we need some different views and different functionality for platform engineers in our observability tools to make sure that this different way of thinking, it's kind of a layer, right? Like a platform layer, is covered. Very exciting discussion. And I think platform engineering is one of the hottest topics at the moment. And getting this Vercel-like experience for your own platforms, it really seems like a wow moment if you see that for yourself. At least for me, it was. And I'm looking forward to follow Humanitec and your journey, Kaspar, even more. And I also know that we both will be at KubeCon, and we are sponsoring the House of Cube party.
Yeah,
so,
very nice.
Inviting people to come visit us and join the discussion.
Absolutely. Mirko, thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. I'm always sharing new insights and insider knowledge about observability on LinkedIn. You can follow me there for more. The podcast is produced by Dash Zero. We make observability easy for every developer.